Is there a right way and a wrong way to paint watercolor birds? This week I've been painting birds, a lot of them, and more than once I've asked myself if I'm going about it the right way. Of course, I realize there's no right or wrong way when it comes to art, but as beginners we often question ourselves. And so today I'll be painting two birds. The colors and the pose will be similar, but I'll be trying out two different techniques, wet on wet and wet on dry. Then we can look at a side-by-side comparison and see if there's a clear winner. Stick around till the end so I can show you some of the other birds I've been working on this week and share a fun little detail that I've been adding to my watercolor birds. I'm starting out with wet on dry. I'm putting down a light layer of paint covering the whole body. I'm using a mix of yellow ochre and cadmium yellow. The painting will be in real time, so I hope you'll grab your supplies and paint along with me. I'll be cutting out dry time and paint mixing so the video won't be too long, and I'll add some timestamps in the description. Okay, now that layer 1 has had a chance to dry, I've mixed some perline green with yellow ochre. I'll be covering the head and the wing. Perline green is a color I added to my palette fairly recently, and it's quickly become my go-to green for many projects. I love the organic look. It's a fairly dark color, so you can get a wide variety of values from this one color. As I paint the wing, I'm making long feather-like strokes. While I'm covering most of this area, I am leaving some of the yellow underneath untouched. Ooh, I am just about to run out here. Let's hope that I have enough paint mixed up to at least cover the wing. Now my brush is nearly dry, and I'm using what's left on it to add a little texture and color to the underside. I'm not pushing hard at all, I'm just merely raking it along the surface. Now let's move on to the legs and the beak while the body has a chance to dry. I'm using burnt umber now. I'm using a very fine-tipped paintbrush here. I think the side of the brush says it's a 4/0. I do a lot of small painting, so I actually purchased a set of 11 brushes that are specifically for miniatures and models. I've been using them for months and they keep their form really well, and there's a nice range of sizes, from small to super duper ultra teeny tiny. Although technically I think they might call it a 5/0. The only downside is that I'm dipping back into the paint quite often. I'm not sure if that can really be avoided though when we're working with a brush of this size. Okay, now onto the beak using the same color and brush. And once again, I'm raking a bit of my extra paint along other areas of the bird. This is just something I like to do to help tie the whole package together. It's time for the neck. I'm using mainly burnt sienna with a hint of yellow ochre. I'm intentionally allowing some of the yellow to show through from underneath. I'm going to carry this color down a bit, peeking out from under the wing. I'm following the shape of the bird's wing and keeping it very close to the green. Okay, I waited a few minutes for that to dry, and now we'll return to the green. For this layer, I've added more perline to darken it. As I add my feathers, I'm careful not to cover all of the previous layers. You'll notice that I am using a larger size brush for this step. For the head, I'm not going over the entire portion here because I want to keep the top of the head and around the eye looking softer. We don't really want full feathers here. It's more of just a soft, fuzzy surface. I'm adding a touch of that same green to the underside. So that green looks a little bit darker than I'd intended. So I'm going to go over this whole section with a damp brush to lighten and soften. I'm sure I could use a paper towel to lift a little bit of that color up, but I don't think it'll be necessary. I think the dampening should work just fine. Let's throw in a little more brown, darker this time, just touching a few areas around the legs. I'm only adding color to the bottom of the beak, not to the top here. We're getting very close to being done with this first bird, so let's paint in the eye. My first larger circle will be burnt umber. While that has a chance to dry, I'll finish up the neck area, coming in with a darker value than before. Just like when we were doing the wing, I'm careful not to cover the two previous layers entirely. I've moved up to a slightly larger brush size for these feathers. One nice thing about the wet on dry method is that you really can put as much detail as you want into these birds, depending on how many individual little brush strokes you'd like to do. The brown of the eye is dry, so I've added a bit of black to my burnt umber, and I'm making a smaller inner circle. Sometimes I'll try to keep the white in the eye, but for this painting I didn't, So what I'm going to do is come back in with a white jelly roll pen instead. I'll have links to all of my supplies in the description if you're interested. Just the smallest touch here, that's all we need. Okay, so that completes bird number 1 using the wet on dry method. Let's jump right into the next one. For bird number 2, I'll be attempting wet on wet. I use the word attempting because it's not the method I'm most comfortable with. I'm still working on giving up control when painting wet on wet and waiting patiently to see the results. I tend to fuss with my paintings more than I should instead of letting the paint and the water do what they're made to do. I'll try to avoid overworking today's project. I forgot to film it, but I did go over the bird with a light layer of water, and now I'm using a touch of terre verte for the base layer. I'm trying to add plenty of water because I'm already losing that sheen. This paper seems to absorb water very quickly. Sometimes that's a good thing, but not always. In this case, I'm wishing I would have used a paper that's a little less absorbent. I know some of you might choose to cover the entire paper with water to start, and that works too, but I do want my outer lines somewhat contained, so I chose to only wet down the bird itself. For the wing and the head, I'm using terre verte with perline green. I'm already getting some blending and bleeding, and I'm going to embrace it and move on to the next section. While I'm not going with the exact same colors as the previous bird, I do want to keep a similar color palette for our side-by-side comparison at the end. I'm using burnt sienna and yellow ochre for the neck. It's really bleeding into the wet green now. I'll work on the beak and legs next, using burnt umber. I can tell most of my initial layer of water has already soaked into the paper because I'm not getting much movement from the paint at all when I lay down the brown here. Let me know in the comments, do you guys like to mist your entire paper when it starts getting too dry? I know, I said I wasn't going to fuss with it, but I think I want to pick up just a bit of the excess moisture here. Okay, I'm really trying not to pick up too much. Let's move on to the next layer of the wing before it becomes too dry to work with. I'm using perline green with a hint of Payne's gray. Payne's gray is another color that I recently added to my palette and I use all the time. The color is so versatile that I've painted scenes using nothing but Payne's gray. It's such a fun color to use. I'm going to paint the second layer of neck feathers now, a slightly darker variation than the first layer. I'll be sure to add back in some of that color that I removed before. Oops! Like with the first bird, I'm taking small amounts of my color and raking it over other parts of the bird, like the underbelly. Because it's still somewhat wet, I'm careful not to use too much color. I don't want it bleeding all over the place. In fact, I think I did use too much of this rusty orange color than I wanted, so I'll just go over it with some of the Terre Verte that we used earlier for that base layer. It seems to be blending together nicely and muting out some of the orange. Unlike Perline Green and Payne's Gray, the Terre Verte was a purchase that I don't find myself using often. Looking at pictures of it online, it looked like a beautiful, subtle color that would be perfect for all the landscapes I like to paint. But once I actually had it in front of me, I was somewhat disappointed in the lack of color. Even at full strength, it doesn't have the effect I'd been hoping for. I still use it from time to time, but I don't think I'll be buying a second tube. For the eye, I'm only painting one circle this time, since the bleeding would likely be too much and overtake the second circle. I'm using burnt umber mixed with black. I'm using my brush to smooth out the edges that feathered into the green. I'm happy with how it's turning out. It's actually creating some nice depth around the eye. I'm going to throw in a little more color on the underside, and then I think we can wrap this one up. Okay, so there we have it, wet on wet. Now let's take a look at the side-by-side comparison. I do like the more blurred, blended look of wet on wet and the softness of the bird's face. But the details and the texture of the wing is quite nice on the wet on dry example. What do you think? Do you prefer one over the other? Thank you for sticking around. Now let's take a look at some of the other birds I worked on this week. I was definitely getting plenty of practice on this little side bird here, preparing for today's video. And I love that by using different colors, it creates an entirely different bird. Okay, so that detail that I mentioned at the start of this video was adding a touch of shimmer. If you've seen some of my other videos, you know that I love these metallic watercolor paints from CSY Art Gallery. The crystal shimmer is fairly translucent, so I've been adding a thin layer of shine to some of my birds. I'm not sure how much it's picking up in the light here, but I'll try to capture it in a picture. Of course, you could add more, but I like just a hint of sparkle. Wouldn't this be fun, painting a pigeon with its shimmery purple and green feathers? Or maybe adding some to a colorful parrot? That might be a project for another video. See you next time, and thanks for watching.